A shop in Ohio spent 6 hours and over $1,000 chasing a stall nobody could explain. New fuel pump. Rebuilt throttle body. 2 ignition coils. The car still died at every red light. The real problem sat under a plastic cover the whole time, and it cost $40. Not $1,140. It's on almost every car built in the last 25 years, and it fails quietly. It's one of 9 parts most shops barely glance at, because they're too busy checking everything else first. We're going through all 9, working down to that $40 sensor and exactly why it fools even good mechanics. Let's start at number 9. Part number 9. The cabin air filter. It's not under the hood, so it never crosses a technician's mind during an engine bay inspection. It's usually tucked behind the glove box or under the dash, out of sight and out of the standard walkaround. But a clogged cabin filter does more than make your air conditioning feel weak. It forces the blower motor to work harder, pushing the same amount of air through a restricted filter, and that motor wasn't built to run at higher effort for years on end. Keep ignoring it, and you're not looking at a $15 filter anymore. You're looking at a blower motor replacement that can run $200 or more, plus labor to dig into the dash and reach it. Foggy windows in damp weather, a musty smell when the AC kicks on, airflow that feels weaker every month. Those are the warning signs, and almost nobody connects them to a filter most owners don't even know exists. Live somewhere dusty or drive mostly city miles, and that interval shrinks fast. Swap it every 12 to 15,000 miles, or once a year, and you'll never think about it again. But it's far from the cheapest part on this list, and nowhere near the most expensive mistake. Part number 8. The PCV valve. This one lives buried under the intake or tucked behind the valve cover, depending on the engine, and it rarely gets a second look unless something's already gone wrong. Its job sounds simple. Recycle the pressure and vapor that builds up inside the crankcase back into the engine to be burned off, instead of letting it sit there. When it sticks closed, that pressure has nowhere to go, and it starts pushing oil past gaskets and seals that were never designed to hold back that kind of force. Owners bring their car in for an oil leak, and a shop quotes a valve cover gasket or a rear main seal, both multi-hour jobs. Sometimes that really is the problem. Sometimes it's a $20 valve nobody tested first. And when it sticks open instead, it creates a vacuum leak that shows up as a rough idle or a hesitation right off the line, which gets blamed on an idle air control valve almost every time. Turbocharged engines are especially sensitive to this one, since a bad PCV system can drag oil straight into the intake tract and quietly burn through a quart between changes. The real fix is often the smallest, cheapest part on the whole engine. It's just rarely the first thing anyone reaches for. Part number 7. The EVAP purge valve. If your check engine light has ever come on with a code mentioning emissions or the evaporative system, this part deserves a look before almost anything else. Its job is controlling how fuel vapor moves from the charcoal canister back into the engine to be burned instead of released into the air. When it fails, the easiest, cheapest assumption is the gas cap. Tighten it, clear the code, send the customer home. Sometimes that actually works. But when the light comes back 3 weeks later, most shops jump straight to the charcoal canister, which can run several $100s. The purge valve sits right in between those two guesses, costs somewhere between $40 and $90, and is the real cause far more often than either of the parts people check first. A proper smoke test finds it in minutes, but that test gets skipped constantly in favor of a part swapping guess. A rough idle, a hard start, sometimes a faint fuel smell near the engine bay. That's this valve, quietly stuck open or closed, waiting for someone to test it directly instead of guessing their way through it. It's also worth knowing this code can fail an emissions inspection outright in states that require one, so this isn't just a comfort issue. Part number 6. Carbon buildup in the throttle body. Every time your engine breathes, a small amount of oil vapor gets pulled through the intake system, and over tens of thousands of miles, that vapor bakes onto the throttle plate and the bore around it. The result is a rough idle, hesitation pulling away from a stop, and sometimes a stall right as you're braking with the AC running. Those symptoms look almost identical to a failing idle air control valve or a bad throttle position sensor, and because those parts are easier to diagnose with a scan tool, they're often replaced first. A whole electronic throttle body assembly can run $250 to $500 installed. A proper cleaning, done with the right solvent and a little patience, usually costs less than an hour of labor, though on some vehicles the idle needs to relearn itself afterward or the rough idle can briefly seem worse before it settles down. It's routine maintenance almost nobody schedules, because nothing on your dashboard ever tells you it's due. Part number 5. The radiator cap. It looks like the simplest part on the entire cooling system, and that's exactly why nobody suspects it. A radiator cap isn't just a lid. It holds the cooling system at a specific pressure, and that pressure raises the boiling point of your coolant well above 212 degrees. Once the seal inside that cap weakens, even slightly, the system can't hold pressure anymore, coolant boils sooner than it should, and you get exactly the same symptoms as a failing water pump or a blown head gasket. Overheating, coolant loss with no visible puddle underneath, sometimes a slow bubbling out of the overflow tank. Because those bigger failures are so much more expensive and so much more talked about, they get tested first, and a $15 to $30 cap gets reused without a second thought. A cap tester takes a technician about 2 minutes to run. It just has to occur to someone to grab it. Quick pause before we keep going. If you'd rather catch these early than pay for them after the fact, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. Back to the list, because it only gets more expensive from here. Part number 4. The transmission shift solenoid. Inside the valve body of your transmission sit a handful of small electric solenoids, and their entire job is directing hydraulic fluid to the exact clutch pack that needs it to move you into the next gear. When one starts sticking or fails outright, you get a delayed shift, a hard clunk between gears, a transmission that seems to hunt between two gears at highway speed, or one that locks itself into a single gear and won't come out, known as limp mode. Here's the problem. Transmission trouble is one of the scariest phrases an owner can hear, so the instinct jumps straight to a full rebuild or replacement, a repair that can run $2,000 to $4,000 or more. A scan tool will usually pull a code pointing at a specific solenoid circuit, but in the rush to recommend the bigger, more expensive job, that code sometimes gets skipped right past. A single solenoid typically costs $30 to $150, and on plenty of transmissions it's reachable without ever pulling the transmission itself. A rough shift doesn't always mean a dying transmission. Sometimes it just means one small electric valve stopped listening. Part number 3. The coolant temperature sensor. This sensor feeds your engine computer the information it uses to set fuel mixture, idle speed, and even when the cooling fans kick on. When it starts drifting, the engine can think it's warmer than it actually is, so it runs a leaner mixture than it should, especially on cold starts, quietly costing you fuel economy every single morning. It can also send a wildly inaccurate reading to your temperature gauge, and there might not be a scarier sight for a driver than a needle climbing toward the red zone. That one symptom sends plenty of owners straight into a head gasket conversation, a repair that can run $1,500 or more once labor and machine work are included. The actual part behind it often costs $20 to $40, and testing it takes minutes with a simple resistance check. But once someone says the words head gasket, it's hard to think about anything else, and that fear alone drives a lot of unnecessary teardowns. Part number 2. The downstream oxygen sensor. Don't confuse this with the sensor that controls your fuel mixture. This one sits after the catalytic converter, and its only job is watching how well that converter is doing its work. When it fails, it throws a catalyst efficiency code that looks, on a scan tool, identical to an actual dying catalytic converter, a repair that can run anywhere from $500 to over $2,000 depending on the vehicle. Here's the part that should bother you. The sensor causing that code often costs $40 to $80, and replacing it first, before condemning the converter, solves the problem more often than most people expect. Worth knowing too, federal emissions rules require most catalytic converters themselves to carry an 8-year, 80,000-mile warranty, so if a shop is quoting you for one out-of-pocket on a newer vehicle, that alone is worth double-checking. But a much bigger repair carries a much bigger invoice, and that tends to shape what gets recommended first. Part number 1. The camshaft position sensor. The $40 part we opened with. Remember that shop in Ohio, the fuel pump, the throttle body, the 2 ignition coils, over $1,000 before anyone found the real problem? This is that part. Here's what it actually does. It tells your engine's computer exactly where the camshaft is positioned relative to the crankshaft, in real time, so the computer knows precisely when to fire each fuel injector and each spark plug. Get that timing wrong by even a fraction, and the engine either runs rough, stalls, or on some vehicles, won't start at all. Now here's why it fools even experienced mechanics. This sensor commonly fails intermittently, meaning it works perfectly when cold and starts misbehaving once the engine reaches operating temperature, or it drops out for a few seconds at a time and recovers before anyone can catch it in the act. Drive it to a shop, and by the time a technician plugs in a scanner, the engine might be idling perfectly again, showing nothing wrong at all. Worse, a marginal signal from this sensor doesn't always trigger a check engine light in the first place. No light, no obvious clue, nothing pointing a technician toward the one part that's actually failing. So what happens instead? The shop starts where every diagnostic flowchart tells them to start. Fuel delivery. Ignition components. Throttle response. All reasonable, all expensive, and all beside the point if this sensor is the real culprit. Its close cousin, the crankshaft position sensor, causes nearly identical symptoms and gets missed for exactly the same reasons, so both are worth asking about together. Before a full stall, some drivers notice a tiny hiccup in the idle, almost like the engine stumbles for half a second and catches itself. That flutter, easy to dismiss as nothing, is often the very first sign this sensor is starting to lose its signal. The part itself typically costs between $25 and $55 depending on the vehicle, with maybe 20 to 30 minutes of labor to access and swap it. Compare that to a fuel pump, a throttle body, and 2 ignition coils, and you can see exactly how a $40 problem turns into an $1,100 invoice. If your car has ever had an unexplained stall with no warning light, or died at idle and started right back up like nothing happened, this is the very first thing worth asking a shop to test, specifically, by name, before they touch anything else.